instead of the highly programmed kind of talk I normally do, I'm going to take a rather circuitous route through certain things I've been thinking about over the years. And in fact, I made a list of them so you can kind of look at the menu as you might if you were in a restaurant. So, I haven't yet decided exactly what order I would go through those. This was one proposal. And then I thought, well, maybe this would be better. But actually, because after I finish here, Terry Riley is going to be playing in this room. And so I'm going to start by tipping my hat in quite a big way to Terry Riley, who was a very important figure in my musical life. In fact, I could probably say that at least 50% of my ideas come from Riley and the school of people who were operating in the 60s and 70s in what was at that time called minimalism or the new tonalism. I believe that was the other name for it. It's probably hard now for the younger among you to realise what a breakthrough this idea was, that the trajectory of Western classical music or experimental music had been towards more and more atonal and, in a sense, non-musical music. And suddenly there appeared a group of composers who used very, very old-fashioned tonality in a way. In fact, the Riley piece that I'd like to talk about, the piece that made such a big impression on me, was called In C. And there it was. It makes quite a lot of noise, that camera. Sorry, it's all right, don't stop. I just suddenly realised, I kept thinking something was falling apart outside the stage. I just wanted to make sure it wasn't me. I think throughout the sort of late Renaissance into the mid-20th century, the idea had been that music was progressing by freeing itself from issues like tonality and harmony and rhythm. And certainly in the 20th century, as the palette expanded, you had chromatic music, and then you had microtonal music, and eventually with people like Cage and the music concrete composers, you had music that really didn't adhere to any kind of scale at all. And that was sort of seen as an arrow of progress. So it was a very big move when Terry Riley appeared with a piece called In C. It was rather a shock. I'm going to talk a little bit about In C because I want to try to explain why it made such an impression on me. So I made a terrible diagram. I couldn't really come up with anything better, but I'll just tell you a little bit about how the piece is made. So this is the trajectory of time here. And this is bar 1, bar 2, bar 3, bar 4, bar 5, bar 6, bar 7, bar 8, bar 9. And this is player 1, player 2, C, D, E, F. So if it were just that, everybody would be playing in unison the whole time. But Terry had a brilliant idea, which is each player is instructed, stay on any bar for as long as you want. You have to play all the bars and you have to play them in that order, but you can stay on one for as long as you want. So what happens in this piece is it begins like that. Everybody's playing in unison. Quite quickly what happens is that players are playing different bars. So for instance, at this moment you've got 4 different bars being played, 4 there, perhaps 4 there as well. And you know, in the middle of the piece, since it's normally a piece performed with quite a lot of players, you might have 15 or 20 different bars being played together. But because it's all in C major, they all marry up in some way. I was incredibly impressed by this piece, not only in the way it sounded, but in the way it was made. It seemed to me an incredibly economical piece of music. And of course, what's fascinating about it is A, that it's never the same on any consecutive performance. It's always different. And B, Terry is not in a position to predict what it will be either. So it sort of gives you a different idea of what a composer is. Rather different from that classical idea that we gathered from the back of classical record covers, where Beethoven walks around with whole symphonies in his head and sort of sits down and scribbles them out. There's no sense of that here. Another piece that impressed me enormously at that time was a tape piece by Steve Reich that some of you know. It's called It's Gonna Rain. This is my graphic version in a moment. I'm going to show you how this piece works. So, It's Gonna Rain is in a very, very simple piece, technically. It uses a tiny loop of tape. It's about 1.5 seconds long, or something like that. But the loop is being played on 2 recorders, on 2 tape players. And the players are allowed to run out of sync with each other. So you get an effect like this. It's an oral moire pattern, actually. Can you see what's going on there? So again, a very, very simple system. That's perhaps another way of showing it. Yeah, that's a better way of showing it. That's kind of what happens in the piece as it gradually progresses. And you lose all sense of the original phrase, and you start hearing very, very complicated musical patterns. That piece of music absolutely blew my mind for its complete simplicity. And I started to really think about what a composer was. Who was the composer in a piece of music like that? Of course, it was Steve Reich. He had the idea to do it. But you know that most of the things that are happening in that piece of music aren't really happening there in the music. They're happening here in your mind. Because what happens with this piece is that just as your eyes are completely confused by this and start to see circles moving and different shapes, the typical shapes of a moire pattern, so your brain starts to hallucinate a whole music that isn't really there in a sense. It's the result of your brain processes being confused and going wrong and grabbing at whatever they can to make sense of what's going on. So one of the things you could say is that in a piece of music like that, part of the act of composition is being handed over to the audience, to the listener. It's saying to the listener, your brain is active, it's not passive. Again, it's different from the classical idea where I'm the violin player and you sit there quietly and listen to me and try to cough only between movements. In this piece, the whole emphasis is that the work of the music is a collaboration between the music and the listener. So I was starting to think about 2 things here. What is a composer? And what constitutes a composition? 3 things, actually. And the third thing is, what is the role of a listener? What is a listener doing? Not long after hearing these pieces, I did what I would say my own versions of them, so I completely credit these guys with the impulse to do these things. Again, I had started becoming more and more interested in simple systems. I used to call them machines. They're not really physical machines, but they're systems of producing music. And I did it on a record called Discrete Music in 1975, which was a simple system using 2 tape recorders. which I invented in the 60s. And I also did it on Music for Airports in 1978. And Music for Airports was kind of an interesting piece because it had a distinct beginning. It's one of the times I've had a very clear concept of what I was doing. One of the few times, actually. Most of the time I'm guessing and following my nose. But on that occasion, I really knew what I wanted to do. And the piece started in Cologne Airport in, I think, late 1977. I was sitting in Cologne Airport on a Sunday morning waiting to fly back to London. It was a beautiful sunny morning, and it was a beautiful airport. It was designed actually by the father of Florian Schneider, who was one of Kraftwerk. He was an architect. And everything was lovely about this airport, except the music, which is so often the case in public places. You spend 220 million Deutschmark designing the airport, and then the guy who runs the cafe brings in a cassette of his favourite Ibiza rave music. And I thought, nothing against Ibiza rave music, but it didn't sit well in the airport there. I thought it's so stupid that composers aren't really working for public spaces like that. And so I started to think about what you really wanted from music in a space like that. Well, it had to be something that was interruptible, obviously, because there have to be announcements. It had to be something that didn't operate in the vocal range, because that would confuse communication between people. And most of all, it had to be something that kind of got you in the right mood for flying. And the stuff that you mostly heard in airports was played on very cheap cassette players, and it kind of went like that. And you sort of thought, if they can't even get a bloody cassette player to work, how am I going to trust my life into an airplane? So I thought, well, when people come to airports, they're nervous and there's an undertone of feeling that today I might die. I'm sure you will share that with me. So I thought, what would really be good is to have a kind of music which said to you, but does it really matter? So I wanted the kind of music that would make you surrender, actually, that would make you settle a little bit and not worry about being out of control for 3.5 hours, 36,000 feet above the Atlantic, which is a terrifying thought, really. So I started to work on that piece of music, and I kind of worked out how I thought it should be. And in the end, it involved, one of the pieces involved lots and lots of tape players running huge loops of tape, each loop having one sound on, and the tapes thread through chairs and tables. In fact, I've got a picture of how that worked. This is me composing the piece. So this one is going round a Ming vase, a table, and an ordinary domestic chair. But there were about 5 or 6 of these running at the same time. I couldn't draw them all on the picture. Actually, since it's Halloween, I thought I'd better add this possibility as well. But this was a piece of music which, after paying quite a lot of attention to the inputs to the system, which were the voices and piano parts and so on that I used, I let the music make itself, and I sat and listened to it, just like anybody else would sit and listen to it. So this is also an interesting moment when composer becomes listener. the act of composing is actually the act of letting something happen to you. I continued in that vein, making machines, some of which I'll return to later. The most recent public incarnation was an app called Bloom, which was released about 3 years ago. Thank you on behalf of Bloom, who will be pleased to receive that applause. And currently I'm working on with the same chap, Pete Chilvers, on a much more interesting version of the same thing. You'll be pleased to hear. Called Scape. I think I'm not allowed to say that name yet. So just erase that from the record, please. Please erase it from the record. So I started trying to think, what is it that I'm interested in when I'm interested in these kinds of systems and machines? Why do I find that appealing? This has always been the dialogue in my life, actually. The dialogue has always been between acting on a hunch, liking something, even if nobody else liked it very much, following it, seeing how I could make it more likable, and then afterwards looking back on it and thinking, now, why was I interested in that? What was going on? This kind of music, this sort of self-making music, there wasn't a critical language for it at all. In fact, there's very rarely a critical language for anything in the arts, I find, but there certainly wasn't one for this. People didn't know how to talk about it, and they talked about it in the same way they would talk about music of the past, and I thought it's really fundamentally different. It isn't the same thing. In fact, one of my arguments is that what we do nowadays shouldn't really be called music at all. It's as different from traditional music as cinema is from theatre, but we're stuck with this name. There should be a new name, but prize to anyone who comes up with it. But I thought, where is the language with which to discuss this? And where I found it actually was in cybernetics. I made friends with a scientist called Stafford Beer. I'd read a book of his. It was called Brain of the Firm, The Managerial Cybernetics of Organization. And it had one sentence in it which blew my mind. It said, it was talking about complex systems like companies and governments. He said, instead of trying to design the system in full detail, you design it only somewhat and then ride on the dynamics of the system in the direction you want to go. That was the clearest description of this kind of music that I'd ever seen anywhere. So I started reading more cybernetics, and I found for the first time that there was an alternative way to view how things came into being and how things ran. So now I'm going to divert quickly through history to Copernicus. So, because I want to talk about the mindset that we inherited from the Middle Ages and how that mindset was changed and how that changed our thoughts about the organization of things. When Copernicus published his great work, I think it came out a few days after he died, on the revolution of the heavenly bodies, he shocked the world by pointing out that we're not at the center. So this was the first time that the entirely counterintuitive idea that we revolved around the sun instead of it around us appeared. And you can see why that's a hard idea to understand. We still say now that the sun rises and it sets. It's not really true. We're turning, it's not turning. However, this shock to the system, this shock of blowing us out of the center of the picture, was followed, and is still being followed, by greater and greater revelations indicating that we're not really the center of anything at all. In fact, a recent sort of hypothetical picture of the universe is this one. Now, if I can just give you some idea of what is going on here. You probably can't see this very well, but right up there, that's 1 billion light years. Okay. Oh God, that's hopeless. You can't see that at all. Well, no, you just can't see it, basically. Too bad. So we're somewhere in this, but we're not there. We're somewhere. And we're revolving around a little star. Well, no, a medium star, actually. We're really no big deal in the universe, after all. In fact, somebody gave me a very nice analogy the other day. I had been trying to explain to my children something about the scale of the universe, and I heard a really good analogy. Somebody said if you took a football, placed it in the middle of the field, then you would take a peppercorn, place that 25 meters away, that would be the Earth, and then a pinhead 2 inches from that would be the moon. So you get some idea of scale. And then he said, and how far away do you think the closest star would be? The closest star is Proxima Centauri. It's 4,000 miles on that scale. So that gives you an idea of the scale of the universe that we're in, with the 100 trillion stars that we're part of. And this picture has been developing gradually over the last 500 years, since Copernicus, really. We've started to realize that A, the universe is a huge place, and B, we're not in any special part of it. In 1850-odd, Darwin published, unknown to many Southern Americans, published that's kind of a cheap dig, actually. Because the idea of evolution, which is what his book was about, is truly counterintuitive. And I don't blame people for being a bit skeptical about it, because the idea of evolution is the idea that complex things can come from simple things. Now, you can probably see how that relates to this music I'm talking about. The idea that a simple system can generate a complex output is kind of news to us. We're always used to the idea that complexity can only be generated by greater complexity. So we can build a 747 because between all of us, in our minds, we've got more complexity than a 747. But the old picture, which colour shall I use? If we go to blue, I think. The old picture of how things come into being is God and man, then higher mammals perhaps, so on and so on. It's clearly a hierarchy, and it's a sort of pyramid like that, and that's the sort of big biblical idea, and then there are the sort of slithery things down the bottom, and then bacteria. But essentially, we're at the top of that hierarchy. Well, of course, when Darwin comes along, where are we? Where's Darwin? Where's he gone? Yes, here we are. So this is a recent picture of a recent graphic to try to describe the relationships of life, all the things that are alive on the planet. And you see that among all of these, just that little bit there, it's called animals. And we're somewhere in there. And we're in about the same place in that little sphere of life as we are in that big sphere of the universe, which is to say we aren't anywhere special. Now this sense of not being anywhere special is an idea that you can find terrifying, and a lot of people do, or you can find it liberating, because it also, so it doesn't really matter what we do, does it? It doesn't make that much difference. It does produce a certain freedom. The idea that it destroyed is that pyramid structure of organisation. And I want to show you 3 examples of where you find that still. 3 archaic institutions that still have that old idea of organisation to them. That's one, the military. Of course, this should really branch out in thousands and thousands of troops at the bottom. But that concept of chain of command is absolutely built into the idea of military. And you'll notice that there is nowhere on this diagram a line that goes that way. So the chain of command is downwards. Messages flow in that direction, information flows in that direction, and intelligence flows in that direction as well. These people are the smart ones, and those are the thick ones. These people will very likely get medals, and those ones will get false limbs if they're lucky. Another place it happens is in the church, traditional church. This is a map of the Church of England. You'll see at the top the monarch, that's the Queen, Archbishop of Canterbury, then he appears there as well. With the Archbishop, those are the 2 major Archbishops of England. Then there are lots of bishops, lots of deans, thousands of vicars and rectors, and then the ladies who arrange the flowers in the church at the bottom, who, as everyone knows, are the really important people in the church. And again, there isn't a line going back up this way. Information doesn't flow back up. It flows in one direction. The third archaic institution that does this is the orchestra. So I've shown this as a fan, but in fact it's another pyramid. Here's the centre of the pyramid. Unwritten, of course, is composer, who sits above the conductor, and then God, who sits above the Again, if you look at classical records from the 1940s and 50s, the texts on them are very, very funny, because they always sort of like to give the impression that the composer got it directly from God. That God was humming a tune and Beethoven overheard it. Which I think is a bit demeaning to Beethoven, really. Anyway, the same situation again. The flow of information goes God, composer, conductor, first violinist, section principals, section sub-principals, rank and file, basically. They call them rank and file, just like you do in the army. And again, it isn't particularly welcome if the trombone player decides to do something different one day because he's had a good idea. That isn't part of being in an orchestra in general usage. So that sort of hierarchical way of thinking and composing has dominated our thinking for a very, very long time. And we're trying to find ways of moving away from it, of understanding things differently. Now, to give you an idea of a modern diagram, the kind of system that is, the kind of understanding really that is replacing these. Here is, you won't be able to read it, but it doesn't matter at all. Here's the waterworks of the municipality of Kalundborg in Denmark. It's just the way the water flows, you know, what you do with off products and what happens to waste products, where they go. And what you see here is a lot of loops, basically. Things are feeding round in circles. This seems to be a much more accurate picture of how complex systems work. I was was going to say something about Kalundborg. There isn't much to say about Kalundborg, but I did have one thing to say, but I can't remember it right now. There's only 16,000 people there. That's right. It's a small town, but it has this very complex system, and so do all small towns. Big towns, of course, have much more complex ones. So complex systems like this are a sort of ecological understanding of how things work. That's right, that's the word I was after. What Darwin introduced, and possibly more far-reaching than the notion of evolution, is the idea of ecology. He didn't use the word. I don't think the word existed then. But what it means is the idea of interconnectedness. It means the idea that webs of life are very, very complex, and you can't really predict exactly how important each part of that web is. You can subtract a piece and see what happens, which is what we regularly do now by eliminating various species from the earth. And what you find is that the web has to remake itself, or one part of the web becomes viral because it suddenly doesn't have its predator or something like that. They're very, very complex, these ecological interactions. And we sort of know we live in a world like that. And I think we increasingly want to reflect that knowledge and understanding in how we think about things in general, and what we want our art to do. I think we always want art to be at least as complex as our understanding of things. If it's too simple, it's not going to interest us. You know? I don't know whether now to go into culture or... All right, I'll do a side turn. I told you I was wrangling Jack Eno today. I went to an exhibition about 20 years ago of early 20th century Russian painting at the Barbican in London. It was a very, very big show. There were about 150 artists in there. Now that period of Russian painting from, say, 1906 to 1927 was my period. That was the time I loved. And my whole time at art school, really, I'd been looking at the work of that period. In that exhibition, I saw at least 70 artists I'd never heard of before. And they were great, most of them. And I thought, this is kind of confusing. I had thought it was Kandinsky, a few other big names. They were the big names. And what I hadn't realized was that there was this seething scene of people, which included not only painters, but it included gallerists, promoters, collectors, all sorts of critics, of course, all kinds of people who were actually part of the scene. They were part of the ecology of that cultural scene. And I came up with this word, which is the word I used to describe collective genius. It's the genius of a scene, of a group. And I think we're more and more becoming aware that this isn't the time of great men talking to God anymore. This is the time of complicated scenes of collective intelligence. Think, for instance, of what happens when you send an email to somebody. It doesn't even have to be a very interesting email, but think of the number of transactions and technologies that have